Welcome in, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Esther 4:14.
Yeah, a verse I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with already.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point.
Right, we're not going to rehash the basics here.
Instead, we're digging into how other pastors are approaching this.
So you can spice up your next sermon or Bible study, get some fresh takes.
We've analyzed tons of sermons on Esther 4:14,
From churches all over, really?
and some of the stuff they're doing is really, really interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, way beyond the typical for such a time as this stuff.
Okay, so what was the first thing that kind of jumped out at you from these sermons?
Honestly, the creativity around divine timing blew me away.
Hmm. Yeah, it's easy to just say, oh, Esther being queen was no accident.
Right, but Friendship Baptist Church, they took it way deeper.
What did they do?
They connected it to all these other biblical moments.
Okay, like,
God remembering Noah during the flood, the Exodus, even like when Jacob's wives conceived,
wow, so they're showing how even those seemingly small events.
are all part of God's much bigger plan.
Yeah. And that's a great reminder for pastors, right?
Huge. Because it's not just about Esther's life.
It helps people see those little things in their lives as part of God's plan.
Exactly. Now, Holly Grove Church, they had this other cool angle.
Oh, tell me about it.
They compared Esther to Joseph.
Interesting. Both of them ended up in these positions of power.
Seemingly by chance, right? But God was orchestrating it all along.
Yeah. So Holly Grove used that comparison to ask this really thought-provoking question.
Hit me with it.
Are we more like Esther, actively participating in God's plan?
Or are we kind of just passively waiting for God to act, like the Israelites sometimes did?
Oof, that's a good one to challenge your congregation with.
Right. Makes you think about those calls to action in your sermons.
For sure. Now, another big theme was, of course, courage.
Oh, yeah, you can't talk about Esther without talking about courage.
But what I appreciated was how these pastors didn't just leave it at that,
They made it practical.
which is exactly what pastors need, right?
Totally. Our listeners want takeaways, not just abstract ideas.
So how did these sermons take Esther's bravery and make it relatable?
Okay, get this. District Church used Inside Out too.
Wait, the kids' movie?
Yep. They compared facing our own anxieties.
To that scene where joy and sadness have to go see the king of imagination?
Exactly. It's like saying, even in our internal struggles, we can be like Esther.
Wow. That's theologically sound, but also, like, super engaging.
Especially for families in the congregation.
Did any other churches use creative illustrations like that?
Oh, yeah, tons. Atkinson Congregational went a totally different route.
What did they do?
They asked everyone to imagine getting this phone call
Okay.
that just drops everything, demands you act immediately.
Oh, I see where this is going.
And their question was, are we as ready as Esther to answer that call?
Even if it means discomfort, inconvenience, whatever.
Precisely. And that's so relevant for pastors. Isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always trying to convey that sense of urgency and readiness.
And what I loved was they didn't stop at just for such a time as this.
Which, let's be honest, gets overused.
Totally. So seeing these pastors dig deeper was so refreshing.
Give us some examples.
Okay, Hickory Flat Church made this amazing connection to Daniel.
Ooh, I love Daniel.
Both of them faced huge pressure to conform to the culture around them.
But they stood strong in their faith.
Exactly. And that's such a direct line to what our congregations face today.
Totally. It's easy to think of those Old Testament stories as ancient history.
But Hickory Flat showed how they speak to modern struggles.
So powerful. Did any other churches make that kind of connection to today?
West Preston Baptist Church did.
Oh, tell me about it.
They focused on Esther hiding her Jewish identity at first.
Right. And then she had to make this huge choice.
To reveal it, risking everything.
Powerful imagery of personal conviction.
And you can see how that resonates with pastors today,
Absolutely. They're often called to speak truth to power.
even when it costs them something.
And that whole idea of hidden identity, there's so much there.
Right. It's like Esther's story has all these layers waiting to be unpacked.
Totally agree. And speaking of layers, some churches got super creative with their illustration,
Oh, yeah, we saw some good ones.
which is always helpful for pastors.
Absolutely. Seeing how others make complex ideas stick.
So what were some of the standout illustrations you found?
Well, one church, NJ, they had this awesome illustration.
Okay, I'm all ears.
They used banquet imagery.
A banquet, huh?
Yeah, to show how we should build relationships and advocate for others.
Well, we need something, right?
Exactly. It's like setting the table for a feast
I like that.
so that when it's time to speak up, you already have a place at the table.
So smart. And that's something pastors can really use.
Totally. It goes beyond just be brave,
It's about that long game.
of building trust and influence.
Yeah, which is so key in ministry and in life.
For sure. And it ties into that whole thing about Esther's hidden identity.
Oh, right. It wasn't just suddenly revealed.
There was preparation, those relationships she'd already built.
It's those little details that can really bring a sermon to life.
Absolutely. Did any other illustrations stand out to you?
Oh, yeah. FHD Church. They had this really simple but profound analogy.
Oh, yeah, I loved that one. What was it again?
They compared living in God's will to a fish swimming in water.
Ah, yes. When we're in our element, things just flow.
Exactly. And that's such an encouraging image for people.
Right. When they're feeling lost or overwhelmed.
Just get back in that flow of God's will.
Love it. It's amazing to see how diverse all these approaches are.
Yeah, each pastor brought their own unique style.
But they all found these amazing insights in Esther 4:14.
That's the beauty of preaching, right?
Totally. There's no one right way to do it.
You can be creative, draw from your own experiences.
And still be totally faithful to the text.
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway for our listeners, right?
Absolutely. This whole deep dive is about showing the possibilities.
Encouraging pastors to think outside the box.
Find what resonates with their own congregations.
Yeah. It's like we're giving them permission to experiment, to be innovative.
Exactly. But, there's this one thing we can't ignore.
Oh, you mean that whole theological question we touched on earlier?
Yeah, about how Esther 4:14 kind of suggests God's plan would work out anyway.
Right, even if Esther hadn't acted.
That really makes you think.
How do you preach on that without undermining human choice?
Right, like our choices do matter.
Yeah, it's a tough one, for sure.
I think it's okay to acknowledge the tension there.
You don't have to have all the answers.
Exactly. But you can help your listeners wrestle with it.
Remind them that God's sovereignty doesn't erase human responsibility. So it's more about holding those two truths together.
Than trying to solve some puzzle.
Yeah, that makes sense. And look at the book itself.
God had a plan, but he chose to work through people.
Esther's courage, her choice to act, it was still crucial.
Right. It reminds me of that saying.
Pray like it all depends on God. Work like it all depends on you.
Perfect. Maybe that's a way to bridge that gap for people.
Yeah. It shows a partnership between our actions and God's grace.
And it emphasizes the power of making a choice.
Even when we know God's in control.
Exactly. Speaking of choices, I think it's time we make one.
You're right. Let's move on to the final part of our deep dive.
We need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of Esther.
The implications of Esther 4:14 for the whole book.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive into Esther 4:14.
And my brain's still kind of swirling from that last conversation.
Yeah, God's sovereignty and human choice, that's a deep one.
It really is. But we've got this whole other layer to explore.
You mentioned something earlier about a paradox in Esther.
Right. How Esther 4:14 points to her crucial role, but the book itself, it never actually mentions God.
Yeah, that's kind of wild, right? The whole story's about God's people being saved.
But his presence is like veiled or something.
One church, NJ, even brought up how Martin Luther wasn't a fan of Esther.
Yeah, for that very reason. No explicit Jesus,
So how do you preach on that? I mean, our listeners are pastors.
You can't just ignore that God seems MIA from the story.
Exactly.
Well, instead of seeing it as a problem, what if it's intentional?
Okay, go on.
Like a literary device the author's using.
To highlight the mystery of how God works.
Bingo. It's not that God isn't there.
He's just working behind the scenes.
Like one of those Where's Waldo pictures.
You got to look carefully to find him.
And that's a powerful message for our congregations.
Huge. Because the world isn't always black and white.
And God's presence isn't always this big, obvious thing.
It makes me think about how we preach sometimes.
How we try to tie everything up neatly.
God is the problem solver,
But maybe there's value in embracing the mystery.
Showing people it's okay to not have all the answers.
Totally. Especially in a world that's obsessed with easy answers.
Esther, it's a masterclass in faith itself.
It really is. Challenging us to believe, even when we can't see.
To trust, even when we don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. And that's something your listeners can preach on.
Encourage their congregations to consider how God might be working.
Even when it's not obvious, in those hidden places.
It's easy to get caught up in the dramatic parts of Esther.
The for such a time as this moments.
But maybe the real power is in the quiet spaces.
Where God's presence is felt more than seen.
And honestly, that's something we all need to hear sometimes.
Right. As pastors, you're not always going to have the answers.
You can't fix everything.
But you can point people to the God who is working. Even in the silence, even when it's hidden.
That's so good. And I think it's a perfect way to wrap up this deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Divine timing, practical courage, the mystery of God's hiddenness.
Hopefully we've sparked some new ideas for our listeners.
For their sermons, their Bible studies, their own lives.
So as you go back to Esther 4:14,
Remember to look beyond the obvious.
embrace the paradox, the mystery, the challenge.
Of a story where God's presence is more felt than seen.
Let that transform your preaching, your teaching, your own walk with God.
That's it for this deep dive.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking.
Those hidden treasures of wisdom that are waiting to be discovered.